we're very excited to have another opportunity to hear from some expertise on the vexed and exciting issue of parking. And we've got a few things that you should know tonight. We are again recording this session so that people who couldn't be here are able to watch it later. So just a quick reminder to keep those microphones on mute. We are going to have a pretty full agenda this evening, and in a moment I'll introduce myself and my illustrious co-hosts. But yeah, firstly, let's just have a quick moment of thanks and recognition that we get to participate in these kinds of great events and shape our cities. Feel free to speak along with our little karakia. It's the whakataka te hau. Right. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, ke mā kina kina ki uta, ke mā taratara ki tai, e hi ake ana te atakura, he tio, he huka, hauhu, te hei moriora. All right. In case any of you haven't met me, my name is Isabella Cawthorn. I am a consultant, a facilitator, and I have the great privilege of being the editor of Talk Wellington. Co-hosting with me tonight is the extremely famous Oliver Bruce. Oliver, do you want to say a quick word about yourself?
Well, one, I don't think I'm extremely famous, but thank you very much, Isabella. Yeah, no, look, I with Isabella co-host Urban Nerds and do work in micromobility, electric bikes and scooters, and as it turns out, I'm looking at ways to provide more road space for those vehicles to be able to operate safely. Kia
ora. And absolutely crucial, although not with video turned on at the moment, is Alicia Hall, who is the head of Millions of Mothers, and Melanie Vautier, who is of the Tui climate community, and who many of you may have seen in the news last week, beaming in to submit on Wellington's parking policy from an actual car park. Pretty stellar stuff there. So I would like to invite you all to introduce yourselves by jumping into the chat panel and just writing down your name, the place you call home, and where you physically are right now, if that's different. So we won't be doing a verbal intro round because we have a bit much to get through tonight. So please jump into the chat and introduce yourselves in writing, and we can watch those little intros starting to pour in. Lovely. Roy's kicking us off. Thank you, Roy. I will put myself in. Just. All right. Last time we had a couple of people from and then somebody popped up we're ourselves. I would like to draw your attention. Oh, my internet connection is unstable. That's not good. I'm just going to keep talking. Hope you can hear me. I am really privileged with Oliver, Melanie, and Alicia to welcome Stu Donovan. Stu joins us from Brisbane, a land far, far away, where he's employed in two roles. Firstly, he's a researcher for the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. I hope I pronounced that right. And secondly, he's a consultant for Veitch Lister Consulting. And in the last 10 or 15 years, he has worked in the transport and electricity sectors in Australasia and the Netherlands, and he specializes in urban and transport economics and multimodal transport planning and public policy. And over this time, he's worked very closely with local government in lots of different cities and towns to reform their on and off-street parking policies, and most notably in Auckland. So apart from studying and working and making good change, Stu is a devoted family man, and he's also been known to contribute the occasional guest post to Greater Auckland, the blog that inspired Talk Wellington, amongst other illustrious achievements. So while I think we've got everybody introduced now, which is pretty excellent. If you haven't, keep on popping those intros in. And I would like to just quickly give you a run through of what we're going to get tonight. Stu is going to talk first, and then we're going to move seamlessly into a bonus segment for this evening, which is Oliver talking about some of the parking change movement that has been happening in Wellington just since the last seminar, and partly inspired by it. And there's going to be some really exciting calls to action for us there. So after Oliver has spoken, we're going to take questions. So we will be gathering the questions throughout the meeting. The place to put those is in the chat in writing, and we will be theming them as we go. And I will fire them to both Stuart and Oliver to answer. So, all right, I would like to hand the mic over to Stuart Donovan. Please take it away, sir.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Isabella. Thanks, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Hopefully that's coming through okay. So it's a real privilege again to be able to talk to you. I am always really honored to give these talks and work with people like yourself who are passionate about their cities to try and make them better. I want to be clear, this is a very informal discussion and I come into it not knowing all of the answers. So hopefully through this talk, I help you together collectively find answers for your own problems in Wellington that draw on, I guess, some of the lessons, the wider lessons that I've found working around the place. And I think in doing so, I want to acknowledge some of the, I've had the privilege of working with some amazing people. So I don't want to give you the impression that everything we talk about tonight is my ideas in any way, shape or form. I'm very much standing on the shoulders of giants, like we all are almost always. So I've called tonight's talk Leaning In, and I think a lot of you might have, many of you might have joined for last week's talk, and that talk was quite high level. I think it was quite straightforward in many respects. I'm going to give you a brief recap for those that didn't join last week in a minute. Tonight, we're gonna dive into the detail a bit more, and some of it's going to be a bit uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable in the sense that the answer's not always clear, and that that there's work to do here. But hopefully, the information I can give you can help you think through some of those issues. So first off, I wanted to start with a really high-level slide on why should you care about parking and why should people care about parking. And I really hope by the end of this talk you do care about parking, perhaps even more than the start. Just to give you a feeling or a sense for why the stakes are so high, if you assume that the average car requires about 3 car parks, and that's a fairly reasonable assumption, I'd argue, to help you understand why obviously every car needs to be parked at home. In a country where drive to work mode share is quite high, like New Zealand at around 70%, most cars also require a car park at the workplace. And then you have all the other activities around and about, like retail activities and leisure activities, where parking also needs to be provided. So I think assuming a ratio of 3 car parks for every car is about right. So let's also assume that each of those car parks takes up about 20 square meters, and that the value of space, that might be land, or it might be obviously sort of floor space in a building, is around about $500 per square meter. Just for comparison, the average price of land in Auckland right now is around about $1,000 per square meter. So this is not an excessive cost per square meter. If you just multiply those numbers out, you see that the average car imposes a total financial cost through parking of about $30,000. Or if you annualize that, assuming a certain cost of capital, then it's about just under $2,000 per annum. Obviously, that number will be higher in situations where land is more highly valued or space is more highly valued, like Auckland. If you doubled that value to the Auckland level, you're talking about $4,000 per year. Either way, the conclusion I sort of draw from this, which is helps you understand and helps people appreciate why the stakes are so high, is that the cost of parking can often exceed the cost of vehicle ownership. a lot of cars aren't worth very much. And so if we provide people with free parking everywhere all the time, then it's almost the transport equivalent in a financial sense of giving everyone free cars. And that is, I think you can start to get a sense of why parking policy is so important to understanding people's choices, transport choices that people make. Because obviously if you give everyone free cars, then you can expect to get a lot more driving. So if you want to learn more about this, the best source is not to listen to me, but to just go and read a book called The High Cost of Free Parking by a guy called Donald Shoup that was recently updated. So let's quickly, having sort of set that example as a reason to, as sort of an example of why parking is so important, let's recap what we talked about last time. So previously, I mentioned how emotions actively shape parking policy and how the frustrations that you feel when you drive and can't find a car park actually flow through to the political level and cause quite a bit of carnage on the ground. And that the opportunity we have is that we can use space more efficiently and we can kind of implement parking policies that short circuit that frustration, that avoid that frustration from taking place. And I'll talk about how you do that. And last time we also talked about what I call pre-cooked policies, which is really just learning from the experience of cities like Auckland, but also further afield, San Francisco has done a lot of work. And last talk, I gave you some references to documents where you can read a bit more about that. The main takeaways, synopsis, if you like, is that the evidence suggests prices are much more effective at managing demand than time limits for various reasons. The opportunity we have is space is scarce and parking space intensive, and better management in a sort of managing parking now so that people don't have so many frustrating experiences can help you build support for further reforms. So this isn't a sort of static one-off situation where we come in and you implement the best policies from the outset and you're done. I think it's much better to view parking reform as a process where you want to get started as best you can and get the ball rolling, and then get the ball rolling quicker and quicker over time. And finally, that final point there that we talked about last time was about how you can link your policies, which can be quite technocratic, to evidence and the experience that you're trying to deliver on the ground. This image to the right here is from Cathedral Cove, which I presented as an example last time of a highly rural setting where parking is actively managed by DOC and working in conjunction with the local council. And what they do is there's an extremely constrained site where they can't provide much parking, so they charge for parking in that location, and they run park and ride buses from another location, which is more accessible and where they can provide more parking. So it's just an example of how parking management policies are already being regularly applied more and more in rural settings, let alone urban areas. So in the short run, where we got to last week, I was thinking about this after the fact. I think you could summarize that the last talk we had in the sort of concept that in the short run, parking policies face a simple tension. And that tension is between cost and convenience. So, your parking policies can provide free parking or try to provide free parking or very cheap parking. The cost or the compromise you're making there is that it'll often be less convenient. If you price parking really low and try and make it free, for example, often parking will be full. It'll be very hard to find a car park. It'll be congested, more congested than it would be otherwise. So basically you're compromising convenience if you provide a lot of try and provide low cost parking. Most of the evidence that we talked about last week supports taking the convenience pill. And the way that works generally is that you're looking for the right price where parking is well used. So you want the parking that you provide, you want it to be well used. Nobody really wins from empty car parks, but you don't want it to be over full. So typically around 80 to 90% is the sort of target. And you can think about that level of occupancy basically means that every 10th car park is available. So you shouldn't have to drive too far to find somewhere to park. And the right price may well be zero in some parts of the city and at some times of the day. And what this approach delivers is sort of the confidence to know that parking is available when and where you might need it. It just might not be free. And I think that's a step in the right direction. I think in the short run, this takes us from a situation where people have really relatively inconvenient experiences with parking to a situation where, okay, they might have to pay, but at least parking is available when they need it. Now, in the long run, and I think in the long run, things become a lot more interesting. And the reason it becomes more interesting is you get to grapple with more challenging questions. We touched on this last time around how much parking do we want to supply? Because the amount of parking we supply will obviously influence the price that we need to charge to achieve that sort of level of occupancy, that 90% level of occupancy. And some of the other questions are, if we start charging for parking more often, how will people respond to that? What sort of behavioural changes will they make? The third part, which is related, is what are the distributional or equity impacts of charging for parking? We talked about this last time at a high level, but I want to give you a more detailed sense of how I think about these issues. And I want to acknowledge up front that I'm not an equity expert. You know, I'm not an expert in social equity. But we will dive a little bit deeper into that. And then we'll finish with some conversations that I call dinner time discussions, because it'll be approaching dinner time for me at least. And then we'll take some questions. So let's lean into the discomfort. So in the long run, we have more flexibility with our parking policies. We can choose at the level of public parking we provide. And also we also have influence over the private parking that's provided. And those choices influence the price that you can charge. Now, as a general rule of thumb, if the price of parking in your city is below the market price, or the resource cost, if you want to think about it that way, then that's kind of telling you that there's an oversupply, that you're oversupplying parking relative to what the market would deliver. And now that on its own is not a problem, right? We often, as a society, we choose to oversupply certain goods like education and health because they have wider external benefits for society. I don't see really what the wider external benefits of parking are. If anything, driving and congestion tends to be a negative external benefit. So there's a big question here over, you know, if the price of parking is below the market price, typically, why have we adopted policies to deliver that outcome? I don't, you know, there's a lot of history there, but going forward, I think we need to question that outcome as to whether it's desirable. Worth keeping in mind, the market price of parking is not constant. In that example that I gave at the start around, you know, what is the sort of value of parking that a car requires? One of the key input assumption there really is the value of space or the value of land. And that value will vary enormously over space. So just to give you an example, in Auckland city centre, average land values are around $9,000 per square metre of land. Outside the city centre, the average is closer to 1,000, like I mentioned before. And obviously, you could split that up again between urban and rural, and you'd probably find that rural land is around $100 to $200 per square metre, and urban land is probably on average more like $300. So the implication of that is that you know this cost of parking is highly variable across space, and so when you think about charging for parking, we're really talking about the location. We really need to charge for parking and use space efficiently in these areas where land is highly valued. So that helps. I think when you think about it that way, it helps you understand why it might be okay to have free on-street parking in low density environments, but not in city centres. In busy corridors where you have sort of constrained corridor width, the opportunity cost might actually be defined by what you might do with the space otherwise. So if you have on-street parking, the opportunity cost might be you can't have cycle lanes or you can't have bus lanes and things like that. And that can also be a significant opportunity cost. Okay, so what should we do in the long run? I think if you find, which I'm 99.99% confident you will, if you find that the price of parking and that people pay in Wellington is generally below the market price, then I think you should adopt policies to address that oversupply. So policies that lead to relatively less parking being provided in the future. I emphasize the word relatively there because you might find that you don't actually need to change the amount of parking you have today. It's just you don't provide any more as you grow. And Wellington, like most of New Zealand cities and towns, is in the fortunate position that it is growing. So you can actually just, you know, sort of think about what you do going forward without angsting too much about the past. So an example of the sorts of policies that you might want to do to achieve relatively less parking in the future is removing minimum parking requirements. So those are policies that require developers to provide parking when they develop. You could just remove those requirements and let developers choose how much parking they want to provide, which is typically a lot less than what's required. And this isn't pie in the sky stuff, but, you know, I mean, you say remove minimum parking requirements and some people snort on their lattes, but including myself the other day. But here's an example from Canada, this is the city of Edmonton. I think last week or the week before, their city council voted unanimously to remove minimum parking requirements everywhere. Edmonton is about 900,000 people. It has levels of PT usage that are a little bit higher than Wellington, around about 10 to 15% higher than Wellington per capita. But it's not, you know, it's not hugely different. This is a New World city with a reasonably okay public transport system. It's not amazing, and they've removed minimum parking requirements everywhere. Why should you do it and how? I think I'm going to start to sound like a broken record possibly, but the reason you should remove minimum parking requirements everywhere is simply because space is scarce and we need to use space as efficiently as we can. I think there's a related point, which people also, I think when I tend to dismiss, because there's such an enormous status quo bias in society, that the status quo bias is the policies we have must be motivated by evidence on some level. And so we tend to provide, and this is when I say we, through the district plan and the planning process in New Zealand, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the status quo and trying to provide the evidence to justify departures from the status quo. The problem is, in this case, is there's really no scientific evidence to support MPRs. And when I say no, there's like none. I've looked, and there's no academic papers or academic research showing that the benefits of minimum parking requirements exceed the costs. The research that does exist goes the other way and shows the benefits of removing minimum parking requirements exceeds the cost many times over. So that's the why. We can talk more about that if people like. It's confronting to some people. And it's confronting particularly, I find, to people who have been involved in the planning system in New Zealand. And they may have even professionally put their professional judgment on the line in a hearing situation, say like the Environment Court, and they've had to argue against developments on the grounds that they're not providing enough parking. And I find that often, those people are often some of the most vociferous opponents to the suggestion that we should remove minimum parking requirements. And I think it's partly a little bit of a defensive professional reaction. Because like I said, if you look at the evidence, then it's fairly clear. But I think that emotional reaction is important. And I think we need to engage and validate it and realize that it's not these people who have been put in a position where they argue against development on the ground of insufficient parking. It's the policies that are the problem, and they're not the problem. They're just doing their job, and they've been sold a lemon. Basically, we've adopted policies that we shouldn't have, or at least that we should have gotten rid of. How do you do it? I think the talk last time was really emphasized the benefits of managing public parking effectively, because if you do that and you're avoiding those frustrating experiences that people have tended to have with parking in the past, it creates the space where it's easier to talk about removing minimum parking requirements. It's very hard to talk about removing minimum parking requirements if your public parking is always full and it's always a struggle to find a car park. I think a good place to start, and this actually was greatly beneficial in the Auckland context, is to really engage with professional organizations like planners, lawyers, developers, engineering associations as well. Often the people in those organizations I've found are very open to engaging with the issues. And in the unitary plan hearings in Auckland, where they proposed removing minimum parking requirements from about, I think the area affected is about 40% of employment and about 15% of the residential dwellings. So that's sort of saying that's the area in Auckland that is not subject to minimum parking requirements. So they didn't go as far as Edmonton, but they did go quite far, and they went a couple of years ago. So they were a little bit ahead of Edmonton. They just didn't go quite as far. But what we found in those unitary plan hearings is that a lot of the professional organizations like IPENs, urban design, architectural organizations submitted in favor of the council's proposal to roll back minimum parking requirements. And that was very valuable, because those organizations are, you know, they're fairly independent, and I think a reasonable amount of weight gets put on their view. And then, of course, the communities. You do need to engage with the communities. I think we need to be bold as well and honest, and just, you know, not try and gild the lily too much. I see a lot of jurisdictions getting into trouble in some respects by trying to avoid the fact that there's no evidence for minimum parking requirements. And what they tend to do is go out and argue, for example, for a reduction in minimum parking requirements. And they try and do that because they see it as sort of a more moderate middle ground. But the thing is, you still get beaten up just the same. You know, I don't think you get beaten up less as a council for proposing reducing minimum requirements as you do if you just propose to get rid of them altogether, because there's no evidence that they work. So I'd very much advocate for being bold. In the long run, what these sorts of policies help you to do is, we showed this slide last week, so I won't dwell on it too much, but it's the cost of parking, the financial cost of parking in one of Auckland Transport's off-street parking buildings versus the price that is charged to users. So blue is the cost and orange is the price. You can see that the gap, the percentage gap, so what users pay is cheaper, is below what the cost is, you know, so parking is still subsidized even in Auckland city centre, but the percentage gap has narrowed over time. And that's what we're talking about. For context, for those who weren't with us last time, Auckland removed minimum parking requirements in the city centre around about the late 90s. So it's about where this graph starts. And then around about 2010 is when Auckland Transport and Auckland Council came into existence and started grappling with these issues, I think, quite well. So you can see the percentage gap changed. So that's really all I want to say about long run parking supply and policies is, you know, if you find that you have an oversupply, then you need to adopt policies that reduce that oversupply. Removing minimums is the obvious one. I'll come back to this at the end so we can talk about some of the other policies like parking maximums. I think there's a really important question here about, okay, let's take that. If you accept that, we should, you know, start charging for parking more based on demand. How will people respond? The short answer is nobody knows. The reason we don't know is because people's responses are extremely complex. And I'll give you an example of this from overseas. There's many ways that people can and do respond to priced parking and transport costs generally. So many ways, actually, that the people themselves often don't know how they respond. So I'll come back to that point. That may sound a bit weird. One thing to keep in mind is that many of these options for responding to prices don't involve changing mode. As soon as you start talking about price parking, there's a tendency for the discussion to shift very quickly to public transport. And I would advise that I would caution against that tendency. The reason that the reason that you don't want to focus on public transport too much is that many of the options aren't related to public transport. They might be related to parking in another location, so parking further out and walking, for example, traveling at another time, or even traveling to another destination. And one of the mode shifts that is quite common is carpooling. It's quite common and it's commonly overlooked. Carpooling obviously enables people to split the cost of parking. And this is something that we know people do. Students are particularly do this to avoid parking charges or reduce parking. Mode shift is very relevant to commuters, typically. But the thing to keep in mind there is that commuting is only a relatively small proportion of overall travel, around about 20%, 20-25%, even in peak times. So that's always worth keeping in mind, that there's a tendency to focus on mode shift, which is only a fraction of the overall ways that people can respond. And there's also a tendency to focus on commuters, and commuters are only a fraction of overall travel. So just to highlight this point, when you're thinking about how people respond to parking prices, I think there's some quite useful experience with road pricing in Stockholm. Now, obviously, road pricing is not exactly the same as parking, but it's quite similar. And the reason talking about road pricing in Stockholm is really enlightening, I find, is because they collected such good data and they did such good analysis of what people did. Here's central Stockholm. It's a beautiful archipelago, thousands and thousands of islands. And here's the old town with the, you can see the palace, not in the foreground, but in the background. So it's a very geographically constrained environment, a little bit like Wellington, and they went with road pricing. And what happened? Okay, so road pricing, which charged higher prices for driving across the Courtenay in peak times. The charges, I think, were about €2 per crossing. So that's about $3 per crossing. That charge led to around about a 25% reduction in person car trips across the Courtenay. Out of that 25%, about 10% were commuting trips that shifted to public transport. So they saw this shift in the data. They saw that about 10% of the reduction was associated with the shift to public transport. Another 6% was attributed to changes in the location and frequency of discretionary trips. So people didn't necessarily travel to the city centre as frequently as they used to, or they didn't travel into the city centre at all. What's missing is, from those changes, is the 9% of trips that just disappeared. And the really interesting aspect of this disappearing traffic is that when they surveyed drivers were generally unaware that they had reduced their trips across the Courtenay. So about 3/4 of the decrease in trips went unnoticed by drivers, according to their follow-up survey. And this quote at the bottom, the reference is at the end. The transport planner here emphasizes that over time, so they did this survey immediately after they implemented road pricing, and even immediately after, most people who didn't think they changed their behavior, when actually the evidence shows in aggregate they did. But this guy emphasized that there's lots of things going on over time. People change jobs, they change where they live, new people come into the workforce, older people stop working so much. And after a few years, it quickly became pointless to ask how people adapted, because the entire situation where travel choices were made is changed. Really recommend reading that summary. It's document. It's really enlightening. So this is why talking about behavioural responses to parking prices is quite complex, is because, one, there's lots of different things that people can do and do when you look at the data. And secondly, a lot of people don't even know what they do. so it's after the fact. So this is hard. What we do know is that the sort of overall magnitude of the demand response, in terms of if you increase parking prices, how does demand respond? That is fairly consistent across studies. And that works out at about 10% increase in prices leads to a 4% reduction in demand. Commuters are typically more price sensitive. So that highlights how, you know, parking prices might be expected to drive a reasonable shift to public transport for commuters, if it's available. And if it's not, I'll talk later soon about what else they might do. The other interesting thing, and I think this relates to what Oliver's going to talk about later, is that parking prices also reduce vehicle ownership with an elasticity that's about the same. So when I talk about elasticities, if you're not familiar with that piece of jargon, all it means, it's an economic term, all it means, so here, is that a 100% increase in prices leads to a 50% reduction in vehicle ownership. That's what an elasticity of -0.5 means. So there's a fairly good evidence base about what the effect of prices is on total aggregate demand for parking. There's much more uncertainty about the underlying behavioural responses because of the things that I was talking about before. But there are some useful case studies. And I actually think this is a situation where case studies might be the best way to study it, because just because it's hard to get data before and after on everything that you want to capture. So Donald Shoup, he comes up again. He did a study in 1997 that looked at changes in travel demands at 8 workplaces in California, where employers offered their employees parking cash out. So parking cash out, for those who aren't familiar, is if you're in California, if you're an employer that gives your employees free parking. There is, or at least was, there was a state law that said you had to offer them the equivalent value in money to not drive. That's what parking cash out is. And that was a law that changed, came into force in the late 90s. And what Shoup found when he analyzed the data for these workplaces in detail is that due to this parking cash out, solo car drivers and vehicle kilometers fell by 17% and 12% respectively, so a decent drop. There was a substantial mode shift, first and foremost to carpooling, secondly to public transport, and third to walking and cycling. And Shoup also presents the benefit cost ratio, and he sort of argues that the benefits of this initiative outweigh the costs by a factor of 4. Important to emphasize that these workplaces are typically what we might think of as quite car dependent workplaces. California is not known as being a bastion of public transport and urban outcomes more generally. So that's kind of what you can say about prices and behavioral responses on a high level. We can, if people have questions, we can unpack that a little bit. But it's worth bearing in mind that it just varies so much across location. But the main message is if you do start charging for parking, there will be a demand reduction. That demand reduction tends to be strongest amongst commuters or people who have parked for a long time. And people will do a lot of different things to, a lot of different behavioral responses give you that demand reduction. And it's really hard to know in advance what it will be. Really important question that came up last time was about the distributional effects of price parking. And I think I gave you a sense for what I see in the data, which is that my hunch is that pricing parking is going to be progressive on average. It's going to target high-income households, households that are higher, that have higher than average incomes. I'll give you some evidence of this from the Australian context. I think it's important to start by acknowledging that the sheer diversity of the people in the population and their circumstances mean that almost all public policies will have some negative implications for at least some disadvantaged households. At least that's my experience. Even seemingly innocuous policies like free libraries, or you can imagine a scenario where free libraries requires an increase in rates, and that increase in rates affects an old person who might be vision impaired that doesn't benefit from the library, although libraries have wonderful resources for other people now. But you can sort of see, if you drill down into the detail, you can typically find some households that will be disaffected by almost any public policy. The more interesting questions are, I think, is what are the overall levels of social spending, and how progressive is that social spending on average? And then I guess the more gutsy question is price parking likely to narrow or widen existing inequities? I'm going to start at a high altitude, and I just want to caveat again that I'm not an expert in this stuff. There's a recent report by the OECD that looked at public social spending on working age populations as a percentage of GDP. This is for the OECD countries, which is a fairly eclectic bunch. There's quite a lot of variation. You can see New Zealand there is sort of in the upper third of countries. It spends about 14% of its GDP on social spending for the working age population. That's less than countries like Sweden, Finland, Netherlands, where I've lived. It's more than some other countries like Norway. Bearing in mind when you look at these graphs that percentage of GDP is not actually dollars per capita. So obviously Norway has an enormous, a much higher GDP. So they can spend a lower percentage of GDP per capita and they probably still end up having higher social spending in dollar terms on the working population. So there's no perfect way to look at it. But when I look at this graph, what I take away from this is that government in New Zealand government, central government, spends a moderate amount of money on the working age population. Not a lot, but not little either. It becomes really interesting when you look at the degree to which the social spending is targeted to low-income households. And I must admit, this surprised me. New Zealand has the most targeted cash transfers to low-income households in the OECD. So we actually do quite well, even compared to countries like Finland, Netherlands, and Denmark. So, and Sweden. So what this graph says, when you think about it in conjunction with the previous, graph, is New Zealand spends moderate amounts on social spending, but we tend to direct it to low-income households quite well. We shouldn't feel too bad about that. You can still argue, of course, that we should spend more, and I think that's a valid argument. But this says to me that of the money that our central government gets through tax revenue, and of the money that it spends on social spending, it seems to target it quite effectively to low-income households. Obviously not perfectly. So relating that back to parking, what does that mean? When I think of New Zealand and I compare it to Australia and other places I've lived, New Zealand actually does quite well from a governance perspective. We can always do better, but I don't get the sense that taxes and charges, like parking charges raised by government in New Zealand, is being used to fund the lifestyles of the rich and the famous. I actually have quite a lot of trust and confidence in the public sector in New Zealand to spend tax revenues quite wisely. And so if you think about parking revenues and charging for parking, of course, the question is not just how progressive are those charges? Do they target, are they being paid by high-income households? Is one side of the coin. But the other side of the coin, which is as if not more important, is how is that revenue then spent or used by government? And what I'm trying to get at here is that to the extent that I can tell, I think government agencies in New Zealand tend to do quite well with spending money in ways that are targeted to low-income households. You can always think of ways they can do better. So on the surface, as a starting point, I don't have a problem raising money from parking. The question then is, how does it affect existing inequities? Does it widen it or does it narrow it? Are parking charges being paid for by wealthy people or are they paid for by low-income people? I looked at this from two angles of car ownership and household income. And I've got to speed up a bit here because I'm running out of time and I don't want to cut into Oliver's time too much. This is for Australia. I looked at the data for Australia and I estimated an elasticity. I'd like you to ask yourself what direction you think these relationships run, and then I'll show you. So for car ownership, what you find is the car ownership increases strongly with income to a point, and then it actually starts to decrease a little bit. And I think there's some logical reasons why. Is that initially, when people get more income, they do tend to spend it on more cars. But then as their income grows further, what tends to change is the location of people. And so high income households are more likely to live more centrally in locations where they might, denser locations where they might not need vehicles so much. So this is an interesting relationship. So this is obviously just a sort of a graph of two variables. When you pull this data into a model where you can try and control for a few other things, you actually get a very clear, unequivocal positive relationship between income and vehicle ownership, to the extent that doubling income leads to about vehicle ownership increasing by about just under 60%. When you look at journey to work, car journey to work mode share, the effect is much more complex, and you find a much smaller but still positive elasticity. So the use of cars to get to work still increases with income. It's just not as strong as the effect of income on vehicle ownership. So what this says to me, to paraphrase, high income households definitely own more cars, and they tend to be more likely to drive to work, but only slightly. One thing I don't control for is destination. And this is, I think, the kicker. So even on average, household income, car ownership and journey to work mode, car journey to work mode share increases with income on average. If you were to control for destination, so, think of the Wellington City Centre where parking is more likely to be priced, and the sorts of jobs and activities in Wellington City Centre, those activities and jobs are even more slanted to high income households than the city as a whole. So on average, vehicle ownership and journey to work, car journey to work mode share increases with income. And I think especially once you start to control for destination, you'll find that relationship is even stronger. So that's why my suspicion is that charging for parking is likely to be highly progressive. That statement is of course conditional on what government uses the money for, which is where we started this conversation about equity. So I think that, highlights, if there's any public servants listening, why, from a political economy perspective, it's quite important to talk about what you use revenue for. Logically, you can sort of just say, oh, we collect parking revenue, it goes into a big bucket and we use it effectively. But if you can't help people, if you can't show people that you are going to use the revenue from parking in a way that is also progressive, then you're kind of you're not building the strongest case that you can. Here's some data from Wellington, from a report, some research I did with a guy called Peter Nuns, who's based in Wellington. This is publicly available. It looks at the share of commute journeys driving basically across a cordon into Wellington City Centre, and that's on the horizontal axis, and we're plotting that share of commute journeys affected by a road pricing charge in this case versus median household income. And this captures that dimension of destination that I didn't control for in my analysis, which is that the sorts of jobs that tend to be affected by these charges tend to be high income jobs. So that's why you find this positive association with income. Okay, dinner time, and time to hand over to Oliver shortly. So leaning into the discomfort, I'm just going to finish with three quick questions that we can come back to and expand on if people want. Is the removal of minimum parking requirements conditional on the provision of public transport? No. The removal of minimum parking requirements can be justified solely on the grounds that space is scarce and parking is space intensive. The fact that removing minimum parking requirements also encourages people to make better transport choices is a positive bonus. It's not the main course. Second controversial or common question, is the removal of minimum parking requirements linked to the imposition of parking maximums? Again, the answer is no. And the reason for this is that, much like road pricing, parking maximums are primarily designed to manage congestion. So that's why you should adopt them. The adoption of parking maximums should be determined by the effectiveness with which they manage congestion. That's and associated negative effects, external environmental effects and carbon emissions and stuff like that. That's a completely different argument from the space efficiency argument that justifies the removal of minimum parking requirements. That doesn't mean that in some areas you might not do both. You might, in some areas, remove minimum parking requirements and impose maximums, like you have in Wellington City Centre, have had since the 90s. But the arguments that you use to motivate those two policies are very different. And they need to be different because they will be challenged in a planning hearing by developers who don't like what you're proposing. So you need to have very clear arguments about why you're making these policy changes, and the arguments for why you should remove minimums from across the city is quite different from the argument about why you might impose parking maximums in some areas. What should we do about residential parking permits? This is where I'm going to hand over to Oliver. It's tricky. The Local Government Act, we covered this last week. We looked the text up. The LGA requires that fees for parking permits does not, quote, exceed the reasonable cost of the service. Now, this is tricky because when councils issue parking permits, Oliver's going to talk about this, they are effectively foregoing revenue. Is foregoing revenue in the sense that they then won't get as much revenue from parking coupons or meters. Is foregone revenue a cost? Now, as an economist, I can say quite clearly the answer is yes. If you give away parking permits and you forego revenue from coupons and meters, that is a cost to council. Legally, it seems to be a bit unclear, and I'm not a lawyer. So at this point, I'm going to check out and pass over to Oliver. Oliver, sorry for running a bit over time.
Not at all. Thank you so much for your expertise. I love watching what you do because I learn so much every time we do it. Cool. All right, team. I'm just going to pull up all right. I think we can see this. This is okay. Okay, cool. All right, excellent. Well, look. Yeah, off the back of Stu, conversations with Stu and conversations with Isabella and others, I wanted to kind of take you through a proposal that was put forward by Connect Wellington and why. What it was that we were looking at in terms of residence parking. So I want to start out by just I didn't know much about residence parking when I began, so I'll take you through the sort of like how it breaks down very straight in a very kind of simple way. So you have general on-street residence car parking in a lot of areas in town. In those areas, it's free. It's in most of the city, and it's really first come, first serve. Most people who kind of have parking in the city actually generally have general on the street car parking. Then we have these things called coupon zones, and those are in most of the inner suburbs in Kilburnie. And if you're a resident, you can get an exemption granted to you at about $120 a year. But the coupons, if you wanted to go buy a coupon, so say for example you're a commuter and you wanted to drive in and park in Mount Vic, that would cost you around $200 a month or $2,400 a year. And then there's residence car parking, and that is a specific zone within these suburbs where for $200 a year you can park in you can park in those residence car park zones, and you can also park in the wider suburb as well. So if you pay for the residence car park for Mount Vic, you can park anywhere in Mount Vic, even in the coupon zones. But they're limited in supply. There's only 2 available per house, or one available per unit in a multi-dwelling. But there's a kind of key assumption under all of this, which is that all households have a car, which is not actually correct. In Wellington, only about 13% of households that have have no motor vehicle, and there's about 41 or 42% of those vehicle of the city that has only one motor vehicle in the household, and then there's obviously more an increase. And it has a really interesting impact, which is that as we think about on-street car parking, what ends up happening is when there isn't enough on-street car parking available, the council turns around and it does this, which is you may have seen from last week, which was that that it's starting to require, or it requires anybody who wants to build or densify our neighborhoods to go in and put in new off-street car parks. And that's largely tied, as far as I understand, and Stu can talk to this as well, to the requirement that they need to have, that there isn't a way for the council to manage the on-street car parking. So they say, we can't have, there's too many cars in this area and we can't manage them on the street, either through residence car parking or because it's general on-street car parking and we haven't got a mechanism for managing that car parking in that area. And so we'll make people have to have off-street car parks, and that can be very prohibitively expensive, to the tune of $100,000 or $200,000 if you want to go and try and densify that area, even though it may be in an area that's close to town, right next to a bus stop, where the majority of people are going to be using public transport as the means to get into town. And there's a sort of wider question there as well that wider point there as well, which is that I think that in general, residence car parking, the way that it's currently priced, is actually really cheap real estate. And, Stu's talked to this as well, which is there's an economic cost of maybe $1,800 a year for a car park, and yet we only charge it out at $120 to $200 a year, specifically in Wellington. And that really kind of, when the whole thing came about for me was because I was living down on Oriental Parade, and I went to go and get car parking thinking it was going to cost me a couple of $100 a year at least. And I got it for $90 for the year. And that just really got my goat, because I was paying $270 for a room, and then I could pay $1.84 right next to it and park my car for effectively what was nearly free. The residence car parking in Wellington, so if we look at it, the market price, as I said, for the coupons is around $2,400 a year. And so anybody who wants to come in and park in the areas where residents currently park and have to pay for that will pay that price. But if you're a resident, you get it from a 92 to a 95% discount. And I think that there's a sort of a wider question in there for us, which is really around fairness and around saying, if we were to look at this and say, is that actually a fair cost for people to be paying to have their cars parked outside their house on land that isn't actually theirs? It's ratepayer land. Are we pricing that correctly? So I've done a little bit of research. I went in, did a number of, I think the council probably slightly frustrated at me now with the number of requests that I've put in via this excellent service, fyi.org.nz. Happy to take anybody through on how to do OIAs. But the kind of, if we were to look at, to Stu's point around what is the opportunity cost of that residence car parking that we provide at the moment to that the council provides. So as I mentioned, there was two aspects of ways that residents can get parking or discounted parking. One is that they can do it through a coupon exemption. So that's saying I can park anywhere in the neighborhood and I get that for $120 a year, or the residence parking revenue. And so combined, they add up to about $600,000 a year that the council currently collects. But if you were to take it and say, well, either we put it at a $50 a week coupon rate, which is what the market price is, and we know the market price is because people pay it, people pay $200 a month for that car parking, would be in the region of $18 million a year that we'd be collecting, not $600,000. And if we were to say, well, actually, that isn't probably worth it, and you wouldn't have that much demand. So maybe if we were to say, let's reprice it to something that's a little bit more reasonable. So what's the average price of a car park if you want to get it on the private sector? That would be about $30 a week. So if you want to go rent a car park in Mount Vic or Kilburnie or something like that, and you want it to be off street, even if it's outside, that's about $30 a week. And so that is in the tune of about $11 million a year of lost revenue, opportunity costs that the council takes for providing this cheap residence car parking. So at the moment, we're only doing between 4 and 7% recovery on that opportunity cost. And there's a part of me which, really as it comes down to it, I think there's a kind of a fairness question here. And then I also think as well, there's a sort of a wider question there around flexibility in terms of parking. So the Connect Wellington proposal was put together as part of the parking submission. And in terms of the things that we're trying to get one, a fairer use of that land. So the land that all of us as Wellington ratepayers or Wellington citizens have that's run by the council, which at the moment gets a very low yield relative to its assets. I also, to Stu's point, I think there's a very interesting conversation that comes up anytime you want to say, I want to put in a bike lane or a bus lane somewhere, and people say, hey, this is parking, don't touch my car parks. It's a very challenging conversation because oftentimes those car parks are free, as they are down on Evans Bay Parade. And I think in certain areas where you want to have it, you want to have that flexibility to be able to do it. And it's an easier conversation to have if those car parks are actually priced relative to their value rather than provided at cost or effectively no cost. It also improves the attractiveness of other options and reduces car use. To Stu's point, people do, and I'll be completely honest, I live in Roseneath, I get car parking for free at the moment, and if I had to pay for car parking, it would probably make me reassess how frequently I use my car. I already, and it certainly did in when I was down in Oriental Parade. I started to ask questions. If I had to pay a lot more for my car parking, would I still keep my car? The question was probably not, but because it was free to keep on the street, I did. And I think also as well that there is an indirect link, but I think it's possible to make an argument that if we had more expensive on-street car parking, then the council would have less requirements to go and build these expensive off-street car parking, only in the sense that it would be able to better manage those on-street assets, which would mean that we don't need to go and build all this expensive off-street car parking necessarily. So what would that actually look like? Oh, sorry. What would that actually look like? Well, from a political perspective, it's probably a bit impossible to go and I think probably a bit impossible to go and tell everybody who has a residence car parking at the moment for $200 that they just that we're going to up everything. So my proposal was to say we keep all existing permits and they all stay the same. So if you've got an existing permit, you're not going to be touched. You'll be able to continue to get it. Maybe it'll be tied to inflation. But effectively, anybody who's got a current permit, either residence or coupon exemption, would be able to keep it. But any new residents who move into those areas would instead be, they would no longer be able to get residence car parking. We would stop issuing residence parking permits, and we would move instead to something called coupon exemptions. But those coupon exemptions would be discounts to coupon schemes. And so it wouldn't be provision for car parking for residents. It would actually be a discount scheme to the coupon scheme. And I think from a legal perspective, I'm still pushing the council on it a little bit to understand whether or not that would be possible. But we could do a discount of 70% or 80%, which would have it in the region of $400 to $700 a year for car parking in these downtown and kind of inner suburb areas. And then from an equity perspective, obviously, I am interested in how to ensure that those who are really disadvantaged and have legitimate needs and legitimate concerns around or requirements to, that substantial increase in pricing for parking would hurt them, that they are able to, via a community services card, get further discounts. So maybe we could look at a way to have them keep the current pricing. So the idea would be everybody who's there at the moment, you get what you have. Anybody who's new who comes in, you have to get a coupon scheme, and that would be more expensive. That's conceptually how to think about it. So I think it sounds sensible, and it provides more flexibility. But what are we waiting for? As Stu mentioned, there's two acts. There's the Land Transport Act and the Local Government Act that only provide for cost recovery and the cost of the service. And there's a sort of legal question there around whether or not you can say that the opportunity cost is also a cost of the service. As a ratepayer, I believe that's a rate. I believe that's a cost. That means that they're not collecting what I think is fair market rent for these assets, but the council themselves have to assess that. There's also a bylaw as well, which is if we, the fines themselves are capped. And so there's a very significant risk, I don't think this can be discounted, is that if all of a sudden it was $500 or $700 a year to get a car park in Mount Vic or Mount Cook, that actually you would have a lot of non-compliance with people saying, I'm not even going to bother, I'm just going to park in the coupon zone. And if they catch me there, I'll just pay the fine, Now, the reality is that the enforcement's not particularly strict up there. We could probably make it a bit stricter, but our ability to fine is actually capped, and that's controlled by the Local Government Act as well. Though I believe that there might be opportunities there in the bylaws to be able to help reprice that. Effectively, someone would say, I'm not even going to bother. I'll just pay the $40 every 3 months that I get fined. And that'll be cheaper than me having to pay for normal residence car parking. And then the final is that there's obviously voters, and voters are typically members of the residents associations, and I'm still canvassing how residents associations would assess this. My general sense is that they're not particularly excited about this idea of increasing residence parking fees. But I think there's probably a number of arguments that could be made that might bring them around on that, and I would love folks' feedback on that as well. So the final one that I have is ask for anybody who's on the call. One, I just thank you very much for putting up with me and talking about this. It's an area that kind of sucked me in, and I've been concerned about it ever since, and been thinking about it a lot. But educating yourself around it as well is really helpful. Write letters outlining the unfairness of the existing system. I mean, my idea here is to be able to provide ear cover to politicians who want to address it. And there are a number of politicians who do agree in the council that this isn't particularly fair. The Leicester, Mayor Leicester, I think, lost a lot of votes in Thorndon by changing the rules around car parking. Certainly it's an area that does get people excited. But certainly being able to provide ear cover to them who want to be doing things about it makes it easier for them to be able to do this. And then look out for emails regarding what you can do. So I'm still working through with councillors, Isabella, Stu, and others around what an actual campaign around this might look like. And so if you're interested, we do have the emails of everybody who signed up on this call. And if you are interested, come along to Urban Nerds, or you can find me through the Urban Nerds thing and just say that you're interested for updates around what goes on here, and I'll be in touch if and when we have some more action there. Anyway, that's me. So wanted to pass it back to Stu and the rest for questions.
Sure. Well, firstly, can I invite everybody to give you a silent round of applause, because those were two really excellent and very rich kōrero that you've done for us. Now we've got 18 minutes for questions, and I just want to reassure people that we will be sending out to everyone the essentially the slides from this and the link to the recording, and we could probably also include some links to the things mentioned in the presentation, like that excellent Stockholm write-up, and probably even some of the other documents referred to. When you RSVP'd, you will hopefully have seen a question about, are you interested in doing more to help improve Wellington parking? If you ticked yes, or maybe I'd like to know more, then we will contact you and put some things to you. If you tick no, we won't get in touch with that. We'll just send you the summary of tonight. So the questions have been coming through thick and fast, which is great, and Melanie has been parsing them in the background. And one of the ones I'd like to get both of you, but probably Stu, you to speak to first, is what seems to be a little bit of a catch-22, and it's come up in the chat. We've got this example of an apartment block with 72 units and no car parks, and local residents association being really concerned that it's going to put lots of pressure on the existing on-street parking. Now, the catch-22 seems to be where councils are not doing a good job of managing existing on-street parking. That's where they feel compelled to make people who own land to build car parking on that private property. So is it, and look, I know this has come up in Purira as well, where we've still got lots of minimum parking requirements everywhere. To what extent do you have to manage on-street properly before you can get rid of minimum parking requirements for private property? Or is it?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I would like to think, I'm the eternal optimist, that you can make the case even when you've been managing parking poorly. I mean, in that case, the question I would put to those residents is, you can have 72 apartments or you can have 50 apartments and say 30 car parks. So your choice is, in your community, do you want more people or more cars? Yeah, and maybe I'm unusual, but I would always go for more people. I appreciate some people might differ on this, but I think you can still win the argument for removing minimums even if you've been managing parking poorly. It's just harder. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's sort of a follow-up to this around the enforcement point that Oliver raised. If your enforcement is so weak, for and let's set aside for the moment the bylaw that caps the fines. Even if you could fine people a fair bit, it actually takes the warm bodies and the boots on the ground to go out and actually issue tickets. Wellington, like many other places, has parking enforcement that's described as whack-a-mole, and the area that these poor folk have to cover is immense. So places like Tawa are basically the Wild West when it comes to parking. In places like Auckland and Stockholm and San Francisco that have started to transition to doing this better, have they seen a major increase in the enforcement budget, or have they been a bit clever about it? Can you speak to that?
Actually, almost the opposite is that if you manage your parking effectively, then you would ideally see a reduction in citations.
Yeah.
So that's the experience from San Francisco, is if you remove time limits and rely more on prices, you will tend to issue fewer citations, which is great. The enforcement question is a little bit harder because it kind of depends on how you approach it. Cities like Amsterdam, well, firstly, just to back up a bit, technology is making this easier, and the way this works in Auckland is over half of people pay for parking using that AT app now, and all you need to do there is register your car in a particular car park, a particular vehicle, and they know it's there. So if the enforcement officers walk around and a car is not registered to be there, then they can immediately issue a citation, an infringement. It's not like you have to with time limits, you have to mark the car and then come back, right? 2 hours later or an hour later or whatever the time limit is. So that's one reason why price parking is so much easier to enforce, and the enforcement becomes much more effective, and people stop gaming the system as much. But technology is really our friend here in a lot of ways. The way that enforcement is managed in Amsterdam now is that they actually use a car with cameras on it, and the car drives slowly around the streets, and it records the number plates of cars that are parked. And once again, if that car is not recorded as logged in the system, then the citation gets issued instantaneously. So it's not clear that you need more enforcement, and it's not clear that the enforcement costs more. But I think that this comes back to when you're writing these policies, what sort of experience are you trying to deliver? I would be very honest about the fact that you're trying to manage parking in a way that means fewer people get tickets. Actually, people getting infringements and citations is a really bad outcome, and it actually leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. I think is that we've created a situation at the moment where a lot of people are getting free parking because they don't get a ticket, and then every now and then someone gets a ticket and they get pinged for $20 or $30 or whatever it is. That creates a winners and a loser situation, and I think psychologically people don't like that. Whereas if we just charged everyone $2 an hour or whatever, you know what you have to pay. There's less of a winning and losing kind of psychology. Yeah. So that's a long-winded answer. Sorry.
No, good, comprehensive. We've had a number of questions around communicating about parking, and my ears pricked up sort of early in your quarter when you talked about the fact that if we could remove the trauma associated with those few instances where we really have to be somewhere and we can't find a car park, and it we miss the job interview or whatever, and it kind of scars us for years. We can remove those kinds of situations and have that nice, reliable 85-90% occupancy, then that puts us in a much better position to have the conversations about reducing parking or charging more for it or whatever.
Exactly.
I'm conscious also that everybody only has their own lived experience when it comes to parking, and that people are notoriously resistant to, evidence. And and I'm reminded of another eloquent Australian, not that you're actually an Australian, just to pretend one, Stephen Burgess, who begins many of his talks about parking by telling the tale of when he was charged by his boss at a city council with reducing the number of complaints about parking, and they spent more and more and more and more and more, like hundreds of millions on parking, and nothing happened to the complaints. They just stayed absolutely steady. So could you speak to the point at which you stop trying to convince people and just do it, or to what is the value of data in these conversations?
Ooh, yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not a lawyer, and I'm also not a psychologist. I generally think that if you frame your policies as trying to deliver positive experiences, so we're trying to make it convenient to park, we're trying to reduce the number of parking tickets, that's a good start. You should get a lot of people, at least listening to you. It does help, like Auckland Transport did, to start with trials, if you can, to build some local data and case studies that you can talk to. And yeah, beyond that, I don't have a lot to offer. I think it'll vary from place to place. Auckland Transport did have to walk away from some business associations. So they were, so what they said, so a business association might have had an issue with parking because of how it was currently managed. They would go talk to the business association, and all the business association would say is they just want more free parking. And Auckland Transport had to stand firm and say, we can't afford to give you more free parking. So your choices are persisting with the status quo, or adopting this parking management policy that we've found is quite effective and has the evidence. And if the business association was still not on board, they actually would have to walk away. And the best response in that situation was to say, fine, deal with it yourself. Which really, it's not that petty, but it really, walking away in some situations might be the best outcome. But obviously you can't walk away everywhere. There are some situations, if you want to get these trials off the ground and you want to get this new approach working, you do have to get it going somewhere. So you don't want to walk away everywhere. Yeah, so it's hard, but hire a psychologist. My partner's a psychologist. They're great. She's not for hire though. Sorry, just to
sure. I'm aware there is also some really excellent research out by the workshop called Talking About Urban Mobility, which is sort of the psychology and the neuropsychology of how we talk about transport. And I bet there's some gold nuggets in there for how we talk about parking as well.
Sorry, Isabella, can I just add one point? I think you made a really good point there, which relates. Last talk I talked about Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind. And he talks about different sort of moral or ethical values that people hold. Typically, he distinguishes between conservatives and progressives. One of the moral values I think that he identifies, which is relevant to parking, is a lot of conservative people have quite strongly attached to a sense of order. So if you can link your parking policies to delivering an experience that is more convenient, where fewer people get infringements and where there's fewer instances of double parking, for example, because that's actually an outcome that they monitored in San Francisco when they start managing parking more proactively and they maintain sort of a minimum level of occupancy. There's no excuse to double park. And there were much fewer instances of double parking. So you actually get a more orderly kind of parking experience. And that might appeal to some people on a moral level. I don't know.
That's good advice. And yeah, we've really always got to think about how to reach people from all different parts of the political spectrum on this. The comments about businesses are particularly pertinent because often particularly in these straitened economic times, businesses, looking and sounding desperate and probably being desperate and saying, no, we cannot lose that park. It will be the end of us. It's, that tugs at the heartstrings. Now, there's a question. We've had quite a few questions about equity, and it was really great to get that information that you put, Stu. But also really interesting, Oliver, to hear you talking about using words like fairness. And could I get you both, probably Oliver first and then Stu, to speak to equity in transition and how over time, but hopefully not too much time, we can shift from the generally unsatisfactory situations we have right now to better. Oliver, perhaps speak to this question around grandparenting with existing residents' parking permits, and Stu, talk about whatever you like. But riff probably more on the. Oh no, I do actually have a specific question for you. Could you give any examples of parking charges having a progressive effect? And I'm pretty sure that when we say progressive, we mean generally equalizing income levels across society. So transfers from the richer to the poorer. Is that
Oliver? Oliver, yeah, that makes sense. Oliver, did you?
That's the right question. Yeah. Demute, mate. Demute. Thank you.
You're muted.
So the reason we were talking about grandfathering in any sort of changes to a parking policy is it was motivated by, so I presented to the Wellington Council on just the sort of the unfairness of this system. And the first thing that came back was Sean Rush, who is generally actually in favour of increasing the prices of car parks. But his point was, my constituents are going to come back to me and say, I'm a renter, we've got 4 cars in this household, we all need that car to be able to get around, and how are we going to address that? So, and then also as well, there's the kind of just the pure political capital issue, which is, if people go and push this, there probably is going to be some aspect of unpopular, especially if you were to increase the price of all, every ratepayer that I've talked to has been like, well, I already paid for my car park, why should I have to pay more? And it's like, well, it's not yours, but that's fine. We'll have that discussion later. So the notion of grandfathering in is to make it politically acceptable, purely from a basis that's saying, look, everybody who's already in is fine. You'll continue on. That's okay. From here on out, we'll start repricing it, and we'll try and address this issue of equity through a community services card or some sort of scheme in there. Brian Dawson and Chris Calvey-Freeman, both who I hit up about this on Twitter, said, look, when we even proposed increasing the price of parking from $100 a year to $200 a year, which is what they did last year for residents' car parking, they said we received an ungodly number of emails from people who said, I'm a cleaner and I don't, it's very expensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there is going to be, and of course, from a political perspective, it just makes it very challenging if anytime you just need to get one person who's upset about the fact that the cost of car parking has gone up, even though, net we can make a very good argument that this is progressive and it needs to happen and all these sort of things. You'll get one person saying, look, I can't afford to park in front of my mum's house anymore. So what to do about it? So I think the reason we've structured the Connect Wellington proposal like that is to try and address the political aspect of it, and then also trying to have enough mitigating factors in there around equity that we can say, look, we've dealt to the equity thing, that's not an argument anymore. Yes, there's going to be some impact on it, but it's politically acceptable, and let's move forward with what we need to do for parking. Anyway, Stu?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess the couple of things I'd like to add to the equity discussion, which I maybe didn't make clear through the talk, was there's a tendency often to try and just price parking for commuters rather than pricing parking generally, like Oliver has been sort of talking about with residential parking. I want to be clear that that's less equitable from what I can see in the data. So what I tried to present to you is the fact that car ownership increases really strongly with income, much more strongly than car use. Car use is much less strongly related to get to work, for example, is less strongly related to income. So if you take an approach where you really try and ping commuters and subsidize residents, then that will actually be likely, I think, to be less to be less progressive than a situation where you just kind of try and charge everyone more or less equally, regardless of whether they're a resident or a commuter. So that's one equity implication, I think, from what I was talking about, is I think you do need to resist the tendency to just try and ping commuters, because there are actually a reasonable number of low-income commuters who drive to work because they live in locations that are maybe less accessible to public transport. So that was one equity angle. What was the other angle, other thing you mentioned, Isabella?
It was basically if there, it's a question from the floor, if there are any examples of like case studies of places where parking changes in parking policies have had a progressive effect.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't have any direct evidence, direct studies of it. You know, it's very hard unless you hypothecate the revenue and tag it to a particular activity. It's quite hard to say that it's progressive definitively, because all that happens is it goes into council's overall budget and gets used for council's overall things. I do think we need to do more research on the progressiveness of council expenditure. You know, there's very little information at a council level. The information I showed you was for central government, and it seems like central government in New Zealand, for the money that it's getting, which might not be enough depending on your political values, but the money that it's getting does seem to be targeted quite strongly towards low-income households. You could argue it could get more, but just at least it's doing well with what it's got. We have absolutely no idea how well local councils are doing or not. You know, what is the progressivity of local government expenditure versus their rates base? And I think we should find that out. And short of actually sort of saying we're going to raise an extra 5 million from parking and spend it on, I don't know, free libraries or free schools, we should at least know how well we're currently doing. And so I don't think it would be that hard to find that out.
Yeah.
If I may just say one thing, I did explore this idea of saying, so Donald Troop has this idea of taking the money that's raised for parking and spending it in the community that you're raising the car parking pricing in. And so as an idea to make it more politically acceptable, you would do that. And I did the calculations on what it would be for Mount Vic, for example. And there's a number of, based on, if you were to charge real, like full price for the car parks, you would lower the rates in Mount Vic by $1,500 a year for every resident. And there's a sort of interesting question that we could make, which is, if we were to increase the cost of car parking in those areas, could we do a targeted rates reduction in those areas as well? I don't think we should, but it's a sort of another one of these, how do we deal with the equity? Mainly because I don't think it would, that parking cost would necessarily be passed on to the right people if that was to happen, especially for renters. Like effectively the landlords would be like, sweet, cool, I'm going to keep all of that money, still charge you heaps more rent, I don't care.
Cool. We are unfortunately at time, which is really gutting, because there are more questions that we would really like answers to, and this is absolutely an area where I think we're in a good space in Wellington to make some change. I would like to like you all to join me in a virtual round of applause for our experts, Oliver and Stuart. Congratulations for your progress so far, and thank you so much for the great work that you do. We will, I'm just going to commit you to this, Oliver, without asking ahead. We'll send out an email with some extra information in it. Hopefully we can at least provide some links that answer some of the questions that didn't perhaps get a specific answer. But what would be really great is if all of you who are interested in helping improve things one way or another could make sure that you've ticked the maybe tell me more or yes I would like to help box on that Google survey. So thank you all very much for being interested in this stuff and for being part of the evolution of our cities. And yeah, we'll wish you all a very good night, and we'll look forward to seeing you on the internet. Please make sure that you are you've got your the Urban Nerds are in your diary. They are a monthly gathering, which Oliver has set up in Wellington, but we also have virtual ones for those of you who are not in the Head of the Fish. And please also check out the micromobility podcast, micromobility.io, which is Oliver's baby. And check out Connect Wellington, where thanks to the awesome work of Melanie and her colleague, you'll find the submission that we put together with help from a lot of excellent people on parking. And there's a lot of detail about the coupon parking, residence parking transition idea in there. That's all. Thank you so much. Have a great evening, and we'll see you out there shaping the cities. Kia ora.